basically, I'm going to start with speaking fairly briefly about just how this whole thing came to be. Dustin Breitling published an article in A2 magazine, and Shimon picked up on it anyway. He contacted us as Diffractions Collective, whether we want to do a piece. And first we were talking about that would be a standard sort of model of live streaming a cube for onto the internet, so this internet gallery. Eventually we started talking and got to the point where, in fact, Shimon Levitner decided to actually make it in the Infinity program, and that's in a way what we're seeing here. So it's about 3-4 months work of communication and eventual implementation. About the program, of course, or the piece, we at the time were reading Lawrence Lek and his Sinofuturism video essay, and we picked up on a few things in it. Foremost among them, and this is really sort of the centerpiece of the whole work, are the 7 concepts of Sinofuturism, which are copying, computing, gambling, gaming, addiction, studying, and labor, and we in a way superimpose them onto the traditional sort of Bagua trigrams or concepts, the Taoist conceptualization or ontology, which we see in the standard sort of 8-part structure. So, and there's quite a bit of overlap. This was sort of our starting point. Now, what this whole thing is trying to get at, what is this whole piece? It's basically predicated on the conceit that in the future there is a super artificial intelligence which the Democratic People's Republic of Unified China is allowing visitors for a fee to visit and see the rendered brain of the artificial intelligence. Now, maybe back to the conceptualization, this is of course a bit of a sci-fi piece. I think what we really tried to tap into here is this joining of, in a way, the future, this closed loop of the future and the past, which does appear in many sci-fi works, from Daniken to Philip K. Dick to David Icke, for instance, and Conspiracy will be mentioned in the next few minutes. So what we were sort of trying to achieve in a way is to superimpose this very modern or contemporary framework of these 7 concepts which Lek put forth in his Sino-Futurist piece, the video essay, and sort of superimpose them for better or for worse. We tend to think for the better because there is some overlap with the Bagua of traditional Taoist ontologies. Now, why did we choose this format? It seemed, of course, it's a immersive environment. It's a 3D environment made for sort of virtual reality consumption. What we were trying to get at is that there's these two in contemporary China. There's these two sort of industries which are very much budding and which have been invested into quite voluminously. Which is the virtual reality programs and the supercomputational programs, the supercomputers in China. And Dustin is telling me AI, which I think feeds into the supercomputation, of course. And so we were trying to in a way, graph the format or get these two concepts into the work as such. Now, there's a lot to be said for that, and I think we'll get into that also towards the end of this sort of expose, towards the end of this talk, because then Shimon will join us and we'll maybe have a bit of a more in-depth discussion about what is Sinofuturism and what are some of its implications for today's art world, for the economy, and for the use or misuse of technologies. I think Dustin can pick up there.
Yeah, so I just want to thank Shimon as well for putting all his time and effort and energy and willing to brainstorm and go through all the time to sit on the computer and map out and generate this environment. Yeah, so I suppose most people have not seen the original video of Lawrence Lek, Sinofuturism. How many people have? I would just be curious. Okay.
It was posted about 8 hours ago.
Yeah, okay.
So there is some...
Okay, so yeah, I would strongly advise, if you have an opportunity to watch it, because I think it obviously would give this a bit more of a context. But what I found particularly interesting concerning Lawrence Lek and the director and kind of the visionary behind the Sinofuturism 1839 to 2046 video is kind of in his interviews he talks about Sinofuturism for him is not a manifesto, it's a conspiracy theory. And I more or less am beginning to kind of over the past couple weeks, I guess maybe even days more, think about how conspiracy theory works, especially in our piece. As Veet is mentioning, this is a virtual supercomputational environment that is picking up generally people's emotions, their ideas, is having all these kind of predictive capabilities and capacities to know who you are. And so with kind of going back to this idea of conspiracy theory, conspiracy theories, we can think about them in the way that they are generally kind of roadmaps or guidebooks for a large amount of us because, you know, the world is vastly complex. We don't necessarily have the time, nor the energy, or even the human capability to kind of map out all these intricate and complex factors and so forth. So kind of tapping into that idea and looking at the Sinofuturism piece, as Veet was talking about, it centers on these 7 concepts. So I'm particularly interested in this idea of copying. So as we are probably more or less familiar, everything, at least one thing or practically everything in this room, well maybe not everything, but a majority of things in this room do come from kind of Chinese manufacturers. And generally, probably as you are familiar with a lot of these, check your shoes, Chinese manufacturers, they do take designs, blueprints or models from the West, and kind of taking these blueprints and models from the West, perhaps we're also familiar with the idea how a lot of these products become very cheap. They become accessible to a wide populace, as opposed to, let's say, when we have our apples. Even though yes, that comes from those products also come from China as well, and they're produced in China. But generally, even generally even virtual reality, these kind of virtual reality headsets, as we're talking, or as you'll be using and seeing there, China's definitely making a huge investment in that field. And actually, right now, China's actually basically investing in a whole village. The state is funding in this whole village, where there's going to be over 50 firms that are actually going to be doing virtual reality research. So you could think about it in this case that China is the only country really in the whole, well, I don't want to say in the whole world, even though South Korea, as I was understanding too, is promoting very similar ideas, that is kind of having a state industry devoted to virtual reality, or kind of funding virtual reality.
It's really funny. Yeah. You can stop and take a vision.
Yeah, you could do that.
The drones were flying over me. Yep. The drones.
You should feel like that.
It's not appreciated.
Yeah. So, kind of working on those ideas. What also I was interested in, what Veet and a couple of us have been talking about is, China has this idea.
If it happens in virtual reality, does it happen in reality? So on your WeChat profiles, you're going to be docked a couple of points. That'll go down on your credit score, and then I think you'll have to... Was it just the bottom?
Okay, so yeah. So yeah, there's this idea of what they call senzai, and as I was talking about, it's where kind of local Chinese designers and also kind of visionaries are kind of distributing and sharing these designs and so forth. Anyways, I think more the bigger idea that I'm trying to also point to with this conspiracy idea is that if you actually look at contemporary China right now, China has what we can call simulacrumscapes. And what they're doing is they're basically building all these kind of various facades or various kind of flavors or taste of European identities. So for example, maybe you've seen in China, in this one village, one city, Chengdu, that they have the Eiffel Tower, that they have the Champs-Élysées, and then also that they have basically modeled after Venice. They have all these kind of Dutch villages, Dutch town villages, and actually a lot of Chinese live there. And so this is a kind of an idea that I was also more or less interested in, is that China, they kind of view copying and modeling from the West as a way to have some type of power or to have some type of feeling of kind of, well, I guess cultural power over Europe in a way. Because if kind of contemporary China also has a lot of history and background, especially with kind of British colonialism in the 19th century, that kind of influenced its kind of its mindset and kind of its distrust towards kind of foreigners. So in a way, I kind of look at this idea of how China is reappropriating from the West and building and generating these cities and these villages and facades to model after Europe, to feel that somehow, some way, that they have some kind of power or that they have some capacity to know what, in a sense, the West thinks and how the West kind of approaches things. So this kind of goes to this virtual reality idea, because actually China's investing into a lot of these videos, into a lot of the content, they're investing into American companies, and also I believe a couple European companies. And so the kind of conspiracy idea that I'm bringing here is that basically China is trying to invade the mind of the world and invade the mind of the West via these kind of virtual reality headsets and basically acquiring...
I have a question?
Yeah.
Which city you were inspired of when making this super nice thing?
I think I guess we could say Shanghai, Hong Kong,
Shanghai,
any of these places, Pearl River Delta.
Or the archetypal Chinese city.
Yeah. So yeah, I would just say overall, this is we're kind of building on this idea of conspiracy theory, that once you're putting on those headsets, China's basically reading your mind and taking your thoughts and basically having the ability to predict what people in the West are thinking or going to be able to do. So, yeah.
And to continue on that note of living in this kind of world that is a simulation or a simulacrum scape, any sense of that is created out of China and what they're creating right now. I'm going to refrain from saying China in the most Trumpian sense, but
May I say something to that?
we're going to have a question section at the end as well. So
Yeah, wait for later.
Sam, you'll discuss a bit after.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
So on the idea of the simulation and the fact that we're being colonized by a future civilization that is what we're calling the Sino-Futurist civilization in this case, of going back and putting us already into an environment that is built around the simulation, around the inauthentic, as we would say in the West, which is a copy. Building separate models of this, and we are participating in them like a game, in the sense of the video that you're experiencing here is you're set on a track, or you could even call it like a joyride in a roller coaster, or as you're going through a amusement park, a theme park. A lot of the cities that we're talking about in China that are being built like that, or these mock cities that they're being built, there's even a miniature Disneyland that's vaguely resembling a Disneyland, but with different characters, and it's not the same franchise. The same with these small European cities. So they're rebuilding this entire new reality around it. and we're stuck in this kind of reality, whether we like it or not, the way they're creating it. So what you're experiencing when you're going through this is you can't really decide whether to go straight or back. You just can sit there like you're stuck in the Platonic cave, experiencing the shadows of this kind of reality that's being played out in the country on the other side of the globe that we have no sense of. This is nothing new to that area, or it's nothing new to the Chinese, in fact. The way that the countries around and the way that we do gardens and these kind of things play out. We build gardens that are a simulacrum of previous areas. So my point in Sinofuturism is looking at how Sinofuturism can be transposed across different cultures, not necessarily putting China at the center of it, but the concept of Sinofuturism. And my point, a good example for that is Japan in that sense. And so with the advent of something like Nipofuturism, if you want to...
I like the dragon.
Yeah, if you want to say one side of the dragon, two-sided dragon, we can go around that. I won't even go into the metaphor of it. It's really easy to see in Japanese gardens and Chinese gardens how in a Chinese garden you go to a specific place and there's a set bridge that reminds the Chinese of a certain highway in Japan and vice versa in Japan. So when you go to a garden there, it's resembling something from the other side of the Japan Sea, or the Sea of Japan. As we get to the more doomsday clock with that going around the Sea of Japan right now, it's becoming more and more pushed and accelerated to this kind of Sino-futurist view. My point with Nipofuturism is the way it builds from a past, and it has a similar origin as the Chinese with the Opium War in 1839, the Japanese side, the start of the Meiji Dynasty later on when they opened up Dejima to the foreigner. Or more than Dejima to trading. So the bridge can happen between them, and there's a kind of mirror between the civilizations with it all, between Japan and China, just as a primary example. So that mirror becomes the copy, the inauthentic. And it's like the economy of Japan has been accelerated with that, as much as China is kind of switching on this. The Nipofuturism that I envision is something that its heyday is gone. The idea of sci-fi and conspiracy being the underlying themes of the artistic movements going on, specifically in Japan with fetishization of things. So the Japanese tenets the Chinese tenets we're talking about in this with copying, gambling, and whatnot, becomes a kind of fetish and an obsession in Nipofuturism. And that's just one illustration of it. If we can take Nipofuturism as one small example of what's going to happen with Sinofuturism, with the appraisal of cyberpunk movements and sci-fi during the 80s and 90s, we'll see a big bubble emerge out of it, except for the size of population and the grand scope of China, which is changing the horizon. Yeah. So... with that, I mean, Nipofuturism I saw as a perfect example of a microcosm of the Chinese Sino-futurist movement. And by the way, this Sino-futurist movement is not something put on by the Chinese necessarily. This is kind of a expatriate amusement with the Chinese movements moving into the future. And that's what we saw with Lek's video. So what you experience in this video should be much like what Lek created in his two-dimensional interface. This will let you sink into a little hole of that video and kind of go behind the scenes at the same time being subjectified by the storyline behind it. If you look at the videos in the top left of some of them, if you go on Oculus, or you can go onto the BCAA website and actually see this video yourself and put it on VR, and you can see some of the videos put into it. But beyond that, we won't explain too much more. Just we hope we feel subjectified by the future. So
well, there's just maybe two things I'd like to pick up on, because as Casey was saying, I mean, Sinofuturism, perhaps it can already be sort of seen, or it transpires through some of the writing of the CCRU from the 90s, where China sort of holds this exalted position of sort of retroactively functioning from the future, in a way, writings of Nick Land, for instance. And one thing that perhaps is interesting in this sense, It's nothing quite new, and if we take simply the word Sinofuturism, I mean, a lot of times there seems to be this fetishization, as Casey was saying, of the Sino as opposed to actually the futurism. The trouble with perhaps futurism, as if we take the traditional Italian futurism of Marinetti et al., there's always this drive towards the new, which in Sinofuturism, if we can call it that, is never quite present. It's actually predicated on copying, on studying as this sort of very neurotic, a drive or this neurotic tendency. So there's always this repetition, basically. So there's always this, with Sinofuturism, there seems to be this strange discrepancy between the actual, let's say, Lek's manifesto and what it professes, and futurism as it was sort of aestheticized and as it was promulgated in the early 20th century. So that's something to perhaps keep in mind when watching the video. I think we can invite Shimon, maybe?
Yeah.
So if Shimon could come up, that'd be perfect.
I think it's fine. I'm here.
Okay. Well,
Couch surfing.
actually, it'd be cool.
Couch surf with
I have a question regarding your sort of implementation and the way you were actually creating this, because Shimon really was actually made the whole virtual environment. And I'm wondering, what was your perspective on it? Because we, of course, gave some very, very nebulous, ideas and things, but then eventually, when it came down to the nitty-gritty, it was up to Shimon. So perhaps what is your take on Sinovation Ltd?
I think visually the thing is they're made by the original video of Sinofuturism, and I was more interested how to actually move the whole thing into some more futuristic feeling, because I had a feeling the original video is somehow pseudo futuristic. It's actually in some ways not so much, more some retro aesthetics also. So I thought it would be interesting to move it a little bit forward, which I don't know, again, this thing looks against some game from 90s, but
It reconnotates the word something like retro-futurism, which is it's really good with that.
Yeah, but it's a little bit problematic, how to actually do things which should look futuristic with technologies which are not so much the technologies which can be used for this are really expensive and not really usable. So it's I don't know. For me, it's a little bit problem how to actually do this.
I also think it's a problem in terms of the theory, because whenever you look at futurisms, oftentimes let's say Italian futurism, not going into Afrofuturism or Gulf futurism, but
Gulf futurism.
But Italian futurism was always an aesthetic movement, and it almost seems like Lek's video, the manifesto, even though again it retains this Sino-futurist sort of label, is actually getting very much away from aesthetics, and it's more of a platform infrastructure, programmatic force in a way, of course tied very closely to capitalism. This is debatable because, of course, the Chinese state platform can be discussed just how much capitalistic it is. But again, there's this perhaps problem of aestheticizing the future, because you're always aestheticizing with something from the past. And it again ties back into where do you find the new for me?
Because of a retroactive manifesto as well.
Okay.
One key aspect of Italian futurism, though, is that the act of disruption and cutting and separating and relinking. That's something that's not really brought up in futurism unless you take the copying to the full degree. And taking copying and accelerating it to the end, you're taking pieces and chunks of things and piecing them together, and that's something that Sinofuturism, the video by Lek, really put together. So you start piecing things together and creating something new, you end up pulling from the past.
Mm-hmm.
and that's something Italian Futurism kind of got stuck in.
It's if we're talking about Italian Futurism, I mean, for me, and I really want to sort of really focus on this discrepancy because there's explicitly mentioned, destroying libraries, archives, anything of the past in favor of the future,
And war, too.
and war as the only hygiene of the world. Of course, Italian Futurism did turn political after the First World War, but in its sort of initial stages, again, there was this very much this despondence towards older archives, let's say, in the broadest sense, databases. And suddenly you have Sinofuturism, which is actually making like direct contact with this, and it's saying no, it's all copying. There's no like inspiration. There's no the artist as this sort of person who creates. So for me, again, we're back to this discrepancy.
Would you draw this disruption out of Sinofuturism as much as Italian Futurism? For example, Italian Futurism got to the point where it created meals that were kind of impractical. We want to say square coliseums as well, which we can say is fascist architecture, but a square coliseum doesn't make any sense. So they go to the point of not making any practical value. When you go into Sinofuturism, there's no aspect of it that is less practical. There's not a point of excessive futurism being put into it.
But I mean, I would still say technically it does. I mean, there's still that dimension of retro futurism again, because as I was pointing out with these kind of simulacrum scapes, if you look at a lot of the architecture that's built there, it's 19th century, 18th century aristocratic Western architecture especially as well. So in a way, it kind of elevates this as a period that eventually futurism would come to overthrow, because a lot of these futurism would be kind of resisting the aristocratic / bourgeois type of values in the end. So I mean, maybe it's kind of also setting up potentially a platform that
it most certainly is, and I think like what really it's about, and it sort of predates, let's say, perhaps cybernetics, but Deleuze most certainly and Anti-Oedipus is seeing society as a machine in a way. And it goes to design in terms of architecture, where the building was supposed to be a machine, with the manifesto for our futurist architecture by Saint-Elia, and in this way it predates to a certain degree, or it presupposes, it serves as an axiomatic for perhaps again this infrastructure building, this platform building on which Sinofuturism is implicitly sort of based on.
So did you ever think about putting Victorian architecture into the styles of the buildings just to replicate?
But the thing is, like, I was kind of like fascinated about this, like in the original video, like it's like there's like a lot of those things, and I was like thinking, like, if you know, like where is the like breaking point of this like Chinese like futurism, because it seems like for them it's like still this like copying process of the something like from the past, but not really like inventing like something new. And do you think like there is or will be some like breaking point where they kind of like fed up of all those like old things and they have to like invent something like new and their own?
There's one thing in the Sino-Futurist Manifesto in the sense that it's not predicated on building anything new, or I think Lek uses the analogy of a Go game not trying to win by a large margin, but simply trying to win.
Mitigate the risk. Not to win, but to mitigate the risk and mitigate the
future
and win by the lowest margin in a way. Yeah. So it really doesn't, how should I say, feed into this sort of Western sensibility of the artist transcending anywhere, right? It seems to be simply dissolved authorship in general. One thing maybe, sorry, go ahead.
No, just quick note on that. I think it's funny to mention how we're looking at this cityscape behind us and what we envisioned out of the Sino-Futurist vision when Lek actually had a 2-story common 4-person house for the common suburban family in the West, and something that you can't imagine in China with that side of things. So it's funny that he puts these blueprints or 3-dimensional models of a family house from the West, and we have a city. It's perfect. It's we're on one side of a mirror, just looking out the other, and
I think this really ties into maybe something that hasn't been sort of focused on or really pointed out in our talk here is that Sinofuturism has very little connection with China as a sort of geopolitical force. It's actually very much deterritorialized, and it's actually being distributed, and it's being imported or exported just about sort of everywhere. That's something to keep in mind, that it's not necessarily Chinese invention at all. It's just perhaps most palpable, most manifest.
A future that's already here, essentially, as he points out in the film.
Is the Chinese room Chinese?
Chinese room experiments.
And this is one aspect of the video if you guys watch, but it mentions this Chinese room idea, and it's all about living the simulation through the Chinese room. Basically, John Searle's experiment, or experimental thought experiment, excuse me. So it's non-existent, and he used Chinese as a language to illustrate something foreign that he couldn't know. And he's following a process, and so that's what we're kind of stuck in this track.
Questions, maybe?
Yeah. Anybody has a question?
Where's the guy with the question?
I want this dragon discussion.
No, please don't.
There's a dragon on the painting outside, so or a snake. Yeah. Is anybody feeling Sinofuturized?
Doesn't matter if I feel it. So yeah.
Is anybody hoarding their copper wires to make sure the copper and gold wires to make sure that I'm going to just talk about electronics in the.
But maybe we may pose a question. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of sort of active artists in the audience, and do you find yourself sort of going beyond certain capabilities of, let's say, technology? I mean, how much are you invested personally in what you do, and how much do you find yourself copying things that perhaps you see circulating or in some way around you?
Yes.
Copying. Absolutely. Hey, that's a fair statement. Absolutely.
We're copying every day.
Yeah, totally.
Code. Yeah. Yes.
Coding.
So it's already here, yeah.
The moment we're supposed to come up with some kind of artistic solution to our tasks. I mean, Google is a friend.
You just bootstrap on the end of.
Yeah.
But this is how evolution works. Like, this is natural. This is a processes of repetition of copying. And then you lose a fragment somewhere, and it creates a chaos theory for something else.
Mutation.
A mutation, a piece of life. So this repetition of copying actually creates an originality, and through iteration becomes something original in itself as a process.
So you would say, like, you know, for instance, the philosopher Jacques Fresco.
Jacques Fresco.
He's one of the promoter of futuristic city architecture. He was like one of these guys that tried to really architect the most ideal city. So they were like circular and
Venus Project, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
One of his opinions is that creativity doesn't exist at all. That everything is like just some kind of Frankenstein concept. You take a piece of this, take a piece of that, and create into something that's not necessarily horrible, but something new at least. And in the beginning, it's kind of horrifying, but later on, you start to accept that. So yeah. Back to the question again. So you would say like creativity is maybe non-existent or just basically copying.
But isn't there certain creativity in choosing what you copy?
Selection.
What parts you take?
Of course, it's about choice, what you like, the preferences.
So if you take two pieces that nobody ever thought about to put together, it's a certain choice.
You can go back to the Socratic dialogue of what is the sense of authenticity in something, and he relates it to everything to a magnetic rock, and the farther away you are from it, the more chained you are from the rock, but the closer you are to the magnetic stone, the more original you are. And this is the basis in Greek, like Socratic thought, and that I think what Sinofuturism breaks with is that mentality of what is the creativity in that? Is there any value in having a creative sense in choosing the pieces that you hash from? Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't matter. It's and is there any sources that they link to, that they draw to, that they go, or I mean, not they, I'm putting a general Sinofuturists, do they draw from that magnetic stone and say this is this close to the authentic model? Absolutely not. It doesn't matter. It might be even in a sense a troll, like trolling out the originality of something or trolling out the author.
Well, I think another dimension of it too is, especially in Chinese culture, copying is viewed as something actually in high regard. Simply, if you are copying something, you are holding up whoever is the artist or whoever might be the original scribe as someone who should be kind of I'm missing the word. I hate my English right now. Paying homage, but just should be held in high regard in general. And I think this also kind of stems too, if you kind of delve into Chinese metaphysics. Chinese metaphysics isn't really interested in these ideas about origins and ends necessarily. It's more interested in kind of flows and kind of connectivity and kind of this real biological systems approach. So it kind of works in this idea evolutionary-wise that simply through this repetition, through this pattern, through these iterations, somehow, some way, you are going to potentially produce something new. I mean, if we do look at a lot of Western art theory or just Western theory in general, we are obsessed, as we keep pointing out, with this kind of copy and original. And the copy, again, being kind of the effigy, the simulacrum that doesn't hold up to this high transcendent image, whether it may be God and us somehow, some way having resemblance to it as well. But I would say technically that gets changed, especially because you mentioned Deleuze and these guys, where they're talking about how through repetition there arises something as the power of the new, in a way, through going through this constant.
I think this ties very closely to, and Mackenzie Wark makes this assumption when he speaks about Joseph Needham, who was a scientist, and he lived in China for quite some time, was very politically active as well as scientifically. And what he was espousing is that away from this sort of Western metaphysics, posited between, or away from Western metaphysics, there's this Chinese ideal of organicism, which is basically a constant development of strata, developing upon other strata. In this way, iteration could perhaps breed some new conceptions, but it's always almost perhaps able to liken it to a blockchain in a way, a blockchain system.
Question for you, maybe in like the coding side of things. Have you ever picked on a bug and then built something from a bug and gone, that's cool. I'm going to build some script based on this bug.
Not necessarily building a whole script on that, but it does happen that sometimes some bug, some mutation happen, and suddenly I thought, oh, wait a minute, I mean, it's not so disposable.
Yeah.
I can use that. Maybe not for that current project, but maybe for a later project.
Cool.
Just for a cool idea.
But I want to add something, because we are also comparing two cultures which are pretty different. So I know more about theater, and we have this concept as Occidental that we are creative, so because we have big perception of our ego. So we have to show up our ego and create something new every time. But if you compare, I'm more in theater, so the Chinese classic theater, you are good when you reproduce exactly what the master teach you to do. So it's like really repeat the, like they call it the kata, like the movement and how the tradition tell you to do something. So if you want to innovate something, is not perceived in the way we perceive that. Like I'm an artist, so I want to do something new, something different. There's my ego. So maybe they have also different religion behind and different background, and the vision to innovate and bring them ego and different stuff is perceived also in a different way. That's, I mean, from the perspective of like my theater experience, I see that it's totally different. For us, it's insane. I have just to repeat the same things like in the perfect way. This is no art, it's no creative. But we I think really have different approach to new ego and so on.
Have you looked at Chinese and like Japanese theater at all? With even theater, it's
they vibrate and they do no action, and in this moment is like a creativity, let's say, that it's not even.
What to be said for that?
practically burned most of their history during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So
We were talking about that before, briefly.
because we have no like history to go back to and evolve further. Like we constantly look back to Renaissance, for instance, the Barrow time, the Victorian time, and take inspiration from that.
It's difficult to sort of speak about Chinese history again fixed on this like locality, geographical locality, but the Cultural Revolution was not in a way as successful as it might seem from the Western perspective, and there were still very much indigenous sort of tectonic traditions which were kept alive. So it's how should I say, the dominant discourse was, let's say, Maoist. In reality, what persisted through the Cultural Revolution, and perhaps we can see that in the way martial arts have been treated afterwards as, again, this sort of a receptacle of traditional beliefs.
So Confucianism too.
Perhaps Dustin is mentioning Confucianism, which most certainly is also looking backwards towards rights, etc. But it has been, what I'm saying is that it has been to a certain degree rehabilitated, and that perhaps what has been lost is not as much as in the West we might think that it was just a 0.0 and suddenly China started again,
I mean, maybe to some extent what's, I don't want to use lost, but I mean, it is quite extraordinary considering that, after Mao, under Xi Jinping, I mean, this was the largest industrialized, modernized revolution in human history. I mean, we're talking about, particularly around the Pearl River Delta. I was reading estimates, about 30,000 people were just in kind of a small fishing village there. So in the point of 30 years, you get from 30,000 to 12 million people in terms of this rapid industrialization process.
Just 12 million people?
Just 12 million.
Now it's a mega city.
Yeah, it's a mega city, but I mean, no other feat like this in history. So that, I mean, that kind of could link back to, the Chinese Revolution, or kind of the Great Leap Forward in terms of, even though I wouldn't say it's distinctly there, but really kind of imposing and pushing down this really strenuous labor and work effort for the greater collective whole. And the greater collective whole, generally, somehow, some way, getting translated into the West, coming in and somehow modernizing and so forth.
But once again, I think we might be culpable of really fixing the discourse on China. Sinofuturism does seem to be a concept which is, again, being exported, and it has been imported firstly through, let's say, capitalism and industrialization mostly. So it's, I think, very iffy or very difficult to really speak of a Chinese identity, a Chinese essence sort of transpiring through Sinofuturism. I'm not saying it's impossible, it's just difficult.
What is the original Chinese identity? That is the question at hand.
I don't think that's a question.
No?
They probably need to be preoccupied.
No, that's what I mean. We cut from that.
In a big city environment like this, especially in a nation where you have 1.2 billion people, and you have one big, basically unknown city which contains another 8 million people, is do you think that that one individual really has enough space to actually create some kind of a self-identity, especially since from the day they are born they have to start to struggle for some kind of good employment. They can have the best grades at school, the best merit, and that still won't be enough. They still need to have some kind of other concepts, so they are overworked, outburned, and basically not so many interests they can pursue as a side project, side focus. So about that self-identity question again. Yeah. I think I lost it further here.
No, that's a great assumption, yeah.
Any response to that? That's a good end point.
We should invite some Chinese guys.
Yeah,
no, it's not about...
We did.
That's that.
I would also think there's a difference in the way how we look at exactly this, for example, experience, and how a person, a Chinese person, or whatever, person from East looks at it. We are more ego-oriented. When I find myself in an environment like that, I feel like I'm a small person who can't control anything. I'm just being
Good.
dragged around with this
Atomization.
this landscape, whatever. I cannot even choose anything. But if I would imagine myself to be more community oriented and like social kind of oriented, I would watch this as like achievement. Like, I'm part of this. I'm this great. I don't know.
Well, I think that is an element, is especially in kind of Chinese culture, they call it guangzai in terms of social connections. Kind of your level of perception or your level of value to society is generally how your web of extensions, whether it's friends, family, whether it's father, it's son, whatever it may be, and it generally extends all the way up to the states. So it is kind of even this hierarchy that somehow, some way does become realized through the Chinese state platform.
If I may just pick up on that, I mean, in the piece we have this voiceover, right, which is basically in a way the master's discourse, which attempts to integrate you. It attempts for this desubjectivization. It attempts at you identifying with this beautiful, this is the future, you're a part of this, etc. But then we have this, what we included is this bubbling up of, how should I say, babble. There's some music, there's some various talk, etc. And it seems to be that what you posited is, again, this, like, how does the individual relate to the wider society? And just how much do you invest yourself into this meta-narrative, of you, look at this is all yours. Well, it kind of isn't, because you actually had to pay for this, limited access. And at the end of the whole journey, it tells you, buy the extended access code, right? So that you can actually fully, be part of this. But you actually have to, in some way, invest your very personal, credits or money into that. So there's what you identified is this exact point of oscillation, I think, where we tried to sort of home in on, which we tried to home in on.
Yeah, picking off that, I don't think we elaborated too much on that program, but in this kind of subscription package, whatever it may be, what we want to call it, we do identify that there is a company actually based in Shenzhen called iCarbonX, and iCarbonX, what they're doing is basically collecting blood, urine, any types of DNA samples, and via these samples are able to...
This is real, by the way.
Yeah, this is real, and basically to provide health indicators or to provide prediction in terms of how you are going to basically evolve or / how are you going to be able to kind of cope with how the environment is changing in China, or basically what you're consuming, if it's good or if it's bad, whatever it may be. And it's apparently going to become actually integrated in the WeChat platform, and the WeChat platform is basically the biggest social network in the world. I think it's about 800 billion users globally. And so actually the Chinese state is planning to integrate these two things as well. So another kind of form of using, I don't know if you're familiar with kind of this social credit system. Maybe if anyone's seen Black Mirror, there's the one episode. It's on the third season. I think it's the first episode. So there is actually parallels, even though from what I've read as well, there's also some kind of controversies about how the West is reporting it. But if you recall in that episode, she basically has a star credit system. And yeah, so she can't, everybody's rating everyone. And at some point in the episode, she's basically precluded from getting onto an airplane because her credit system is low. There is actually something, from what I've read, implemented to this level where if you are associated with certain friends who have a lower credit system, that can impact you in terms of obtaining a visa from the consulate. That can also impact you in terms of visiting certain restaurants, apparently as well. That also can, from what I was also remembering, I guess, impact you in even purchasing certain items online as well. So you're seeing this kind of as an all-integrated system / platform that I would anticipate is gradually going to start flooding into Western markets. If not, it has already. I mean, technically, if you look at WeChat, it is quite amazing. It's an all-integrated platform. You can practically get everything off there. And I think now Facebook is moving more and more, from what I've gathered, into doing certain things and kind of incorporating certain things.
Did you guys read the disclaimer before using the bathroom? I mean, if you guys don't want to partake in any of this research connected with this, I wouldn't use the bathroom at the gallery. Just making sure you read the disclaimer, though. Okay, we're collecting your insights.
Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you partake. So yeah,
cool. Intense work on this.
And Shimon,
bringing
thank you
this
again.
into reality and bringing it into sight.